Hello, everyone. I'm reading some really excellent work done on this question of drug policy, legalization of drugs, and your interpretation of the readings. Things I wanted to point out. Okay. Please, first of all, the term reification means to treat an abstract category as if it were a real thing. If you make a statement like drugs are bad, and then you go on and you talk about how maybe you saw some stuff when you were growing up, okay, that's all very good. That's a starting up point. A drug is a vast category. All a drug is something that causes some sort of psychoactive effect on your physiology, okay, and elicits a response. Okay, so you can't really go, okay, drugs are bad. Okay, there's many different types of drugs. For example, I just had a cup of coffee, or probably my third or fourth. If we looked at caffeine alone, I would be a drug addict. Also, for example, maybe once, now it's about once or twice a year, I enjoy a cigar. It's tobacco, right? That has a physiological effect. You know, if I smoke dried fruit in a hookah, which I have with Arab friends, that has a physiological effect. It has a psychoactive effect, very mild. So when you talk about drugs, you have to talk about specifics. Okay? You can't just talk about drugs. You have to break it down. Some people have done an excellent work there. The discussion posts I'm reading where that's the case, people have really determined and gone through and sorted out what's what. In addition, illegal drugs are only part of the problem. I've provided, and I'm going to send as an attachment so that you can look over this stuff for yourself, some of the articles that I'm basing this mid-week review of your discussion topic about. The Sackler family were the biggest and most damaging drug dealers in the history of the United States, or maybe the world. They were multi-billionaires. They ran a major pharmaceutical company. They funded medical schools and art galleries, and they're now infamous for allowing their company to haphazardly and with great recklessness promote the very legal and very much pharmaceutically prescribed drug OxyContin. So illegal drugs are only part of the problem. I provided a wiki link to this infamous family. They've now been held accountable in some way, but they are so rich and so powerful and so large that they're much of their fortune is, as is the case, is protected. The second point I would make is, and this has to do with part 2, and the second point I'm making here. Let me share my personal history. I am a recovering alcoholic. Moreover, I'm also a recovering. I used to smoke marijuana, and by point of disclosure, at some time in the past, experimented with other sorts of substances. I'm not gonna implicate myself too much. It's been 14 years since any of that. Right? That said, I can't read my personal experience into policy. Right? It's your personal experiences, you or your family. Yes, they're profound. Yes, they're important, but you cannot stop there. I can't take my personal experience and read it onto a public policy. I simply cannot do it. Why? Okay, Well, first of all, this is a sociology class, not a class in your opinion, or not a class in writing your biography, right? So move very quickly past that into looking at bigger patterns and structures of behavior here, okay? And I'll talk about a few of those in a minute, but first of all, before we move to an examination of social structure, we have to step back and look at something we don't talk about much in sociology, and that's biology, okay? It's kind of a biosocial analysis. And that's point 2 here, and I'm going to post these in the notes. That's the possibility of a genetic predisposition towards a lack of impulse control. That is what I have. That is why the best research from addiction specialists and social work professionals indicates that there's no one program that's effective for everybody in terms of working on this. There is a genetic predisposition towards a lack of impulse control, and there are different kinds of impulse controls. If we're looking at, I've provided a link to this article, I thought, down here, okay? This article here, take a pause for a moment and go fetch the article and get back with you. Okay, so we don't talk about genetics much. I'm back. The possibility of a genetic predisposition toward a lack of impulse control might explain why, for example, your cousin can enjoy a couple of cold beers at a barbecue, or even maybe smoke a tiny bit of marijuana, but your other cousin, or your professor, in my case, from a different set of your grandparents' children, might not be able to stop. And it's called the genetics of impulse control, by Bevilacqua and Goldman from the United Kingdom, okay? And here's a link to that, okay? A number of you have correctly identified, okay, and again, we have to, here's point number 3. I'm 65 years old, okay? The idea of kind of looking at drugs from different perspectives was in its infancy. When I was like 18, 20 years old. Okay. If, however, you were born and you're 45 years old, I am 65. If you were born in 1977, you were raised in a culture where there was a kind of articulation of kind of an anti-drug sentiment by the government, in fact, under Presidents Reagan and George H.W. Bush, which was to some degree kind of a problem, okay? The First Lady at that time, Nancy Reagan, wasn't going to convince anyone not to do drugs. There was all kinds of rhetoric around drug use, and indeed, there were criminal, rather than treating it as if it were a medical issue, which is increasingly being done now. The whole thing was a medical issue that was criminalized. Okay? I've got 2 articles here, okay, that talk about kind of from a critical sociological standpoint, right? That talk about the war, so-called war on drugs, even going back as far as the Drug Enforcement Agency in 1938. And why marijuana is illegal, okay, which I'll talk about here in a second, okay. There are a couple of articles, okay. This one's by Ramirez and Pond Cummings, and it has to do with the racist roots of the war on drugs and the myth of equal protection for people of color. That's from 2022. And this person you may have heard if you listen to National Public Radio, this excellent journalist Donovan X. Ramsey, an investigative journalist for the New York Times. He wrote a book called When Crack Was King, A People's History of a Misunderstood Era. Again, if you were born in 1977, you probably were exposed uncritically to a lot of very odd information. I mean, it was the latest, however, and I'll move on to part 3 now. Okay, about why marijuana is illegal in the first place. So the war on drugs was in the 90s. It was around the latest in a round of, we could call it, structural and cultural racism articulated by the U.S. government. Starting with Harry Anslinger, he was the first head of the Drug Enforcement Agency. Okay, and they countered him. They kind of compared him to Trump's Attorney General Jeff Sessions. These people both ignored. Harry Anslinger was the first head of the DEA when it became an agency in the 1930s. And this is talking about a concept called moral entrepreneurship. Marijuana, indeed, had been quite legal in the United States and used by a certain subpopulation of the U.S. since before this was a country. In fact, if we go back prior to 1918, when there was a drug law passed, we had things like marijuana, heroin, morphine, hashish, opium were active ingredients in over-the-counter pain medicine, medicine for back pains, teething for babies, menstrual pain medicine, all sorts of things. So, of course, no one is arguing here that was a good thing, or that it wasn't, it didn't need to be changed, or that drugs are a good thing. Indeed, personally, for example, again, I couldn't smoke marijuana and function effectively. Okay, that doesn't mean, so I can't read my personal experience onto all of society. I present all this information to you to please in step back a little bit from what happened to you, or maybe even you've had some profound experiences with you and your family, okay, or people in your environment. Those are legitimate, but they are starting off points. They are not in and of themselves the end point of data in terms of this or any other argument that we make in sociology. You cannot do this. And I'm seeing people who just kind of they're just you're sitting in a chair and you're kind of reading this and you're giving your opinion. Not sufficient. Not sufficient. You have to do, and I've tried to model this here, and some of you are doing excellent work. You have to take the time to do a little digging and a little research and really read and think about this stuff, and to indicate it with an American Psychological Association reference at the end of your initial post for these discussions, and for every other thing that you write here has to be supported by research, by evidence, by data, not your statements or your opinion or your thoughts or what you might have personally experienced. That you can't base a policy. I couldn't base a policy based on my personal experience. No one would listen to me. Okay? That's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to take maybe your personal experience as a starting off point. I know I've used mine here, and move it to a larger pattern. Okay, a larger pattern. And then sometimes we have to step back from our personal experience. For example, I'd be a fairly feckless person if I used marijuana, but for some people, if they're suffering from cancer or terminal illness or something else, or there's been all sorts of evidence that it helps with people who have seizures, none of which, thank goodness, I'm suffering from, but they can use that. So I can't take my personal experience and read that onto them. So step up and step back. That is my guidance to those of you who still, at this point, we're in week 3, haven't really use. I can tell when you haven't used references and you're just kind of writing off the top of your head. Okay? All right? So please keep all of this in mind. Thanks. And I'll include this in my I'll include this list here as clickable links in my notes.